Hello, everybody. Good evening. My name is Cynthia Alvarez, and this is the Grand Boulevard Coalition Show. And today, our topic is going to revolve a lot around suicide prevention, since next week, the 8th through the 14th, is National Suicide Prevention Week. And I know we kind of talked about this topic a little bit last year too, but we didn't go too in depth with it. So I thought that this year we'll go a little bit more in depth and talk about some of the prevention ways to prevent suicide, as well as what goes into that in terms of why this topic is important, warning signs, and what we can do about suicide, and talking to people and talking to family, loved ones, and ways that we can support them. But just a quick recap, I guess, of what we did last week. We talked a little bit about things that went on for healthy living, our number one goal, in the past month or so. And we do have an upcoming webinar, which we don't have a date settled on just yet. But if you look onto our social medias, we're going to be posting a online workshop that I will be hosting, focusing a lot on mental health. So it's kind of related to the topic today, just ways to cope, handle stress, identifiers of, our own mental health, how to check in with ourselves, and things like that. So if you're interested in that, that'll be on our Facebook and Instagram pages with Healthy Living CAP, CAP. So if you search that up, our page should pop up. But yeah, before we get into the topic, I want to share some statistics on why this topic is important to talk about. So, suicide is actually one of the leading causes of death amongst youth ages 15 to 19 years old, according to the CDC. So, that was along other things. With suicide, it was also homicide and accidents. So, that could be like car accidents, other accidents, things like that. That are, people getting into fights or other things like that. So those suicide was labeled one of the leading causes. So we take that very seriously amongst young people, especially, right? Because if they have responsible adults or other support systems in their lives, we want these people to be aware of why kids are committing suicide, and go a little bit more in depth with that, right? So, according to a survey that was collected by the CDC, where they collected a lot of data on high school students, their feelings, bullying, feelings of hopelessness and sadness, 4 in 10 students, which is almost 5 in 10, right? Which is almost half of students reported experiencing persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness. So this was in 2023, I believe, 2022 or 2023 when they collected this data. So this is very recent data. And like I mentioned before, and I will continue to mention, COVID has kind of probably played a factor in this, because of when teenagers had to stay indoors, isolate themselves, they weren't talking to other students their age or other kids their age. They weren't able to socialize, further isolating themselves, and they weren't able to express themselves, join any clubs, do things that they actually enjoy. And then once they had to return to high school the following year, or whenever schools allowed students to come back, it was more difficult for them to integrate into that school life, right? Especially if they were maybe transitioning from 8th grade to high school, or even starting as a freshman in high school and then entering in the real physical high school building, probably not until sophomore, junior year, which is crazy to think about, right? And so it's kind of like a whole new experience. And for some of these kids, it's hard for them to talk to people. COVID has made it harder for them to talk to people just because they were indoors, not being able to practice socializing with other kids, experiencing social cliques, and just making friends of their own in person, which is very different from having friends, that you text or just talk through a screen, right? So yeah, a lot of kids, 4 in 10, have experienced persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness. And 2 in 10 students had serious thoughts of suicide. And within those students, female and LGBTQ students were more likely than their peers to feel this way. So we talked, I think, a little bit about girls experiencing mental health issues and what goes into that. We won't go too in depth with that, since we do have a whole episode on that if you want to search through older shows that I've done. But basically, a quick summary is just girls experiencing more suicidal thoughts. Girls are more likely to internalize emotions and internalize feelings, versus their boy or male counterparts that release energy more physically, and release energy in other ways, that can be either physically through violence or through sports or through other things. And it's a lot more internalized for girls, to kind of be caregivers, take care of other people while not taking care of themselves. Those are just some of the things. They're not the main reasons why. But yeah, so just wanted to talk a little bit about that. And while looking at this report, it was a really long report, that went super in depth. So if you want to find that, it's on the CDC, Center for Disease Control website. And while looking through a lot of the statistics that they had, me personally just kind of taking note of what specific races and ethnicities were experiencing higher rates of sadness, or poor mental health in general, and even suicidal ideation thoughts, or even attempts of suicide, right? And while looking at all of those statistics, I've noticed that American Indian and Alaskan Native students were reporting higher percentages of poor mental health, feeling hopeless, and suicide attempts than any other racial group for most of the statistics that they showed. Some of them it might have varied a little bit, but for the most part, it was these indigenous students who were experiencing this at a higher rate. And we kind of learned a little bit about this in school or maybe on the news. They briefly talk about things like this, but I kind of wanted to do a little more research on why that is, right? So kind of going a little bit in depth specifically on this population. They reported feeling most unfairly disciplined at their school. In this study, they also talked about being unjustly disciplined by maybe teachers or security guards at their school, or any adults at their school, just making them feel that way. And they were the highest, reported that the most, that demographic. And also other studies show that they also have higher rates of substance use disorder and overdose death rates, right? And overdose deaths are things that we have talked about a lot on this show as well. Back in August, actually, the 31st was National Overdose Awareness Day. So we shared some information on that, but it's also important for us to note that this population goes through it at a much higher rate than white male counterparts or white American counterparts. And this is something that these students are seeing in their homes, living through. If their parents are going through higher rates of substance use disorders, these are things that these students are seeing at home, right? And they're not getting that support that they need. They're probably not getting that support that they need at their schools. And so they're kind of going through this internally. And other things that play into higher rates of poor mental health is also something known as historical trauma. And this group of people have been through a lot of different things, which I'm going to list here. And this plays a large factor in their mental health, which includes war, it includes genocide, and even forced removal from their homes, from their tribal lands, the place that they felt connected to physically, their environment, right? They were completely displaced and moved from their homes, and even forced integration to mainstream and societal norms, right? So what does that mean? So forced integration to mainstream and societal norms is basically things that happened to this day, but it started really when colonizers and the Europeans came to America and took over land that belonged to the indigenous people in the United States. And so they were forced to basically relearn culture, a new culture. They had to, whatever language they were taught to not speak that language anymore because it was seen negatively by Europeans or the people that had colonized their lands. Going to schools to learn things that they initially weren't learning about before, so now they're in a completely new setting. Even things such as Native American culture, something that I learned not while doing research, but talking to other people that are of this background. Some stories of back then, even in the 1900s or 1800s, when it is the norm for Native American kids to have longer hair. And they, at their schools, the teachers or people at the schools will be cutting their hair, which is actually traumatic for Native Americans. And because their hair is culturally significant to them, cutting their hair means something to them. And so it almost feels like a really heavy loss. So that's something that's very traumatic to them and that they have gone through. That these are things that kind of play into integration and integrating to a completely new culture that they're not used to, being forced into it, right? It wasn't by choice. So these are things that can traumatize them. And that trauma is passed down through generations. Stories told by the parents, telling it to the kids that grew up in that situation, telling those stories to their kids and their grandkids. So that is some of the things that has happened that they have gone through. They've gone through many other things, which we won't get too into. But also another thing is that indigenous people in the U.S. have also lost nearly 99% of their land historically over time. Like I said, due to colonization and the Europeans, as well as forced removal by the U.S. government. So moving them from specific areas to completely new locations, even moving them as far as from one state to another, are things that have happened to indigenous people here in the U.S. In that research that I was doing, I found that there was one tribal community, I don't remember the name of, but they were located originally in California, and they had forcibly removed these people from California all the way to Oklahoma. So if you look up the map of the United States, you can see that's a really far away from their home. It's a completely new environment, completely new species of plants, species of animals, climate, and it's things that they're not used to, right? So they have to completely start over, learn about the new land that they're in, and often the new land that they relocate to is really not the best place for them, which is also something that I learned. Sometimes they're forcibly relocated to land that the settlers and the government consider to be less valuable. So these can be areas where they're at more risk of climate change hazards today, such as extreme heat conditions and less precipitation, right? So higher chance of maybe forest fires or just fires that can spread because, they're very dry land areas. So these are things that are potential dangers to their environment and things that these families and these students and children have to live through, right? So the constant maybe fear of either being forcibly removed from their homes again, or just the land that they're currently in, if they're going to be okay, if their land is going to be stable enough to live in, the environment that they're in, not feeling so stable, can be something that's traumatic, right? And a lot of this can cause, a lot of other mental health issues and consequences, such as PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, a lot of these kinds of things. And even like I mentioned with the substance use disorders and high overdose death rates, it also comes into play when mixing those two together, it can create really unstable homes for these kids and the students that are going to these schools, and then experiencing more unfair discipline at their schools, right? On top of everything the students are already going through at home. And their unique experience are very unique, which I feel like also plays into that, because these kids, Indigenous students, can't relate to a lot of the other kids at their school, because they're not of the similar culture, similar background. They might feel a little bit isolated, especially if they don't have any supports at their school, like teachers or school counselors that relate to them or are able to help guide them through maybe specific and unique situations that they're going through, right? So these are really important factors to think about as well. And other things to consider is that they, kind of like I said, they feel a lack of support from their own schools, but not just their schools, their communities, right? Maybe the area that they live in, the areas that they're in themselves don't have resources such as therapy sources or places for people struggling with addiction, right? So maybe rehab locations. More often than not, I believe they're supposed to, people from specific tribal communities or tribal lands, they are not allowed to, seek help out elsewhere or things like that. So I could be wrong, but these are kind of things where, especially if their communities are so small, they don't really know where else to go to, especially if their parents are not open to looking into mental health services or other services, right? And maybe even the communities that they're in on the outside don't know how to reach out to these tribal communities and help them in ways that can help not only the adults, but the children who are dealing with that as well. And so, yeah, that was kind of a very interesting route that I wanted to take, just because I feel like this community may not be talked about enough, especially with our organization. We do focus a lot on Black and African American individuals as well as Hispanic individuals, because those are the community areas that our program is targeting. So with that, it's still important just to recognize and know the statistics with other communities and other racial ethnicities that are going through these things too. Because I feel like it helps kind of communities come together and realize that there's a lot of similarities in our struggles, which can really help you feel less alone and less isolated in these situations, right? And yeah, so kind of looking more into specific warning signs. It may be difficult to know if someone's having suicidal thoughts from just looking at someone, right? You can't just look at someone and say, oh, they're having suicidal ideation or they've attempted suicide. There can be some signs that are physical, but it's not really good to assume just from looking at someone. Sometimes one of the signs of such as depression, they can be people who maybe are not taking care of themselves on the outside, maybe not brushing their hair, or maybe even kids that come to school with matted hair. And matted hair is hair that's very hard to brush through because there's a lot of tangles in their hair. And that can be something from maybe parents back at home that aren't taking care of their kids' hair, or even the students, if they're old enough, maybe like high school students who are feeling depressed and not maintaining themselves by brushing their hair, which can end up being knotted or matted over time. And other things like that, right? Other physical signs, signs like that are signs of concern, but not signs of suicidal ideation and things like that, right? So some of the signs that I will go over include family history of suicide and mental health issues. This is something that's more for maybe people, professionals or people in care, maybe adults, like teachers who are close to the families that can get to know a little bit about the family, or even relatives, right? If we're close to our relatives or friends of families of friends, you know about specific situations. Maybe you know your friend's family history of suicide and depression, mental health, right? Because suicide isn't just one thing on its own. Suicide is a mix of many mental health issues that can come to light. when talking to a therapist, which is one of the prevention ways which we will get into a little bit later. But family history is one of the things. Also, drastic changes in their mood for the worse, right? So that could indicate maybe that somebody has gone through something traumatic, because if you know this person well, it could be a family or friend, and they're generally in a good mood all the time, and then all of a sudden they come to school, or you see them the next time and they're in a really bad mood, or they're really maybe angry or really sad and quiet. Maybe they used to be more talkative. And this could be a sign of them having gone through some traumatic experience. It could be something going on at home, or many examples, things that kids can go through: abuse, sexual abuse, even just witnessing domestic abuse in their homes can be signs. And can be traumatic for some of these kids, right? And even adults too. Other things such as statements of self-hatred. If you notice someone trying to give you a goodbye, even though you see them regularly, and they're not indicating where they're going, signs of goodbye, maybe sending long text messages, giving big speeches of how much they loved, cared about you, and that they're gonna miss you. Even giving away important things that belong to them and they want to give it to you, that could be a sign that someone's ready to, that has a plan, a suicide plan, right? And if you work in mental health, a lot of the things that mental health practitioners actually say is that if they notice that their client or their patient has gone from being in a really bad mood consistently all the time and then has a sudden switch to a really good mood, that's actually not a good sign. And they say that because if their patient comes in one day just randomly feeling very happy, it could be because they have their suicide plan already created and are ready to go through with it. And that's because in their minds, they're happy, they're ready to leave, and that could be a really bad sign, right? And then some quick things about what we can do, right? Not just the 988's National Helpline, which is a free helpline if you want to call or text, and therapy as well, like I mentioned earlier. If you're a parent, it's really important to start a conversation early about regularly checking in on their mental health. So just really planting it in their minds early on, that sharing your feelings every day is important, even if it's not every day, at least every other day, making sure you're regularly checking in with your sibling or your parents. And parents can make a game out of it using incentives to get kids to share their day, even using something like a feelings board. Put it on the refrigerator and have kids kind of pick out their emotion that they're feeling that morning, and it can even change throughout the day, right? So doing things like that. There's a bunch of other tools and free tools that you can use online as well to help with just learning how to check in regularly. And then if you have friends or loved ones that you care about, it's also important to regularly check in with them as well. There are even apps available online that you can use to check in with yourself, and even check in with friends as well. So yeah, they're mental health apps basically. So if you look up any mental health apps, there's a lot of free ones available that are really good. And just knowing if you have any friends that feel like they don't have anyone to talk to, just being that person for them where you're very open to letting them know constantly, whether they share things with you or not. You let them know that I'm here for you. I'm here to listen to you if you want. If you don't want a solution to anything and you just want someone to talk to, I'm here for you. And things like that. And then one myth about suicide that I saw that I thought was important to share is that the idea of we shouldn't talk about suicide because we will put the idea into their heads, right? So I'm sorry to say that's not true. Not talking about suicide is not going to solve anything. Sadly, if that idea is already in their head, they're always thinking about it, but they're just not going to tell you, especially if you don't talk about it with them, especially if you are a parent or an adult. it's something that you can't avoid by just not talking about it, right? Actually, talking about suicide is a form of prevention, because if you're talking to them and you know, you're able to talk to them about maybe even sharing stories with them, right? Of maybe people that you know, even stories you've seen online of friends that have died by suicide, family, loved ones that have died by suicide, and the impacts of those families that it's had on them. Sharing stories like that might make them, think about it in a different light, right? So it's really important to talk about it and actually share things, share what you're feeling, especially if you're worried about someone who might be really depressed and considered suicide or has talked to you about suicide. Making sure that they're not alone if they are having those thoughts currently. Because sometimes those thoughts can come and go, but actually planning it and implementing it is different than just thinking about it, right? Which is really important to know the difference and just make sure that you know what they're feeling in that moment. And yeah, so talking about it is prevention, and just making sure that as a parent or a friend, you never blame yourself for these things. You are not responsible for other people's emotions, and just making sure that you get them the help that they need. And yeah, there's lots of free resources available, even in Chicago as well, and just nationally online if you search for these things. Make other people aware of it. And I hope that you learned something from this today. So thank you so much for taking the time to watch today. I hope you learned something, and I hope to see you later this month. Thank you. Goodbye.